You know, I saw this a couple of days ago, didn't get the chance to chime in, but let's talk about it. Kovalev's promoter not ruling out a future fight with Canelo. Canelo Alvarez himself. He was quoted as saying, "We do not rule out the possibility of fighting at 175 pounds, Canelo said to ESPN Deportes. At the moment, we have other things in mind, but the possibility exists. It's a huge challenge, but it's the type of things that I like. I know Sergey Kovalev since I was 20 years old, and why not? We can make the fight happen between us, and I like those challenges. There is the possibility of making that fight." Now, main event CEO Kathy Duva, who promotes Kovalev, saw Canelo's comments, and she realizes the possibility of that fight is still some time away. She was quoted as saying, "I saw the statements of Alvarez," said Duva. "At this point, knowing the plans of Canelo, it seems to me the fight with Sergey is not in the near future. But if Alvarez grows into the weight division and becomes a light heavyweight, then such a fight will surely take place. This would be the biggest fight in Kovalev's career." I'm gonna tell you something. Canelo Alvarez is a guy that has no shortage of options, and all those different options are the luxury that his marquee value affords him. Canelo Alvarez can decide to campaign as a middleweight, a super middleweight, or as far as campaigning as a light heavyweight, and there are any myriad of fighters that would be receptive to a Canelo fight.
He's got options.
Canelo's a guy with a lot of options, but every single option is not as likely as the other. Every single option, every single suggestion, just because it's a suggestion, does not mean that that's a fight that we're gonna see in the near future. It's more likely that Canelo Alvarez would face someone in the middleweight division, assuming he beats Daniel Jacobs, assuming he comes out victorious in that fight. It's more likely than not that he faces someone from that division or somewhere near it than Sergey Kovalev. You know, the same way that Canelo's name was mentioned alongside Sergey Kovalev's is the same way that Canelo's name is mentioned alongside Jaime Munguia, a Mexican fighter like himself, a young up-and-comer, a guy who intends to move up from junior middleweight to middleweight by 2020. A fight like that is more realistic and more feasible than a fight with Sergey Kovalev for a few reasons. Now, Canelo Alvarez himself addressed that he's not crazy about the idea
Fighting a Mexican.
in fighting another Mexican fighter like himself because he represents Mexico. He'd rather not face Mexican fighters. But at the end of the day, he does have to entertain that possibility that if a fight with Jaime Munguia is put on the table and Golden Boy / The Zone view that as the best option, Canelo will do it. He was quoted as saying, "At the end of the day, they're the ones that are in charge. If they consider it a good fight, then I would do it, but I would not like it." So, you've got to look at both of those options, look at both of those scenarios, look at both of those potential fights and ask yourself, which one is more likely to happen? Which one is more likely to come off? Which fight is easier to put together? Which fight is more feasible? A fight with Jaime Munguia, who's right there on your same side of the street, co-promoted by the same guys that promote you.
Golden Boy.
He's right there. And then you have Sergey Kovalev, who's not in your weight class, he's not promoted by the same promoters that you've got, and he doesn't fight on the same platform that you do. He's all the way up there at 175, and he fights for ESPN. Out of those two options, Munguia, who's on your side of the street, and Kovalev, who's not, which fight is more likely to happen in the near future? And one can deduce that the more likely fight to happen would be a Munguia fight, not a Kovalev fight. As intriguing as that might be to some, as much as people might want to sit here and hypothesize how a fight like that would look, you know, between Canelo, between Kovalev, as much as they're interested in the schematics, the aesthetic, the nuts and bolts of a fight like that, I'm not going to sit here breaking down a fight that's probably not going to happen and is nowhere in the near future. Oh, granted, it's a fascinating prospect. It's a fascinating prospect of a fight. Canelo Alvarez fighting at 175, some people might say he's biting off more than he can chew. In that way, there's a lot of intrigue attached to that proposition. But along with all that intrigue, there is also how unlikely we are to see that in the near future. So, you know, until wheels are actually in motion for a situation like that, spare me the breakdowns. There are more realistic fights that may happen before that, and I think that that's what we need to focus on. Now, Canelo Alvarez already said he's not crazy about fighting one of his countrymen, but if the people at the Zone and the people at Golden Boy want him to do it, that he'll do it. He just won't be happy about it. But I think that before it even comes to that, because Jaime Munguia very much seems to be a fighter that they are grooming, a fighter that they are growing, that they are in the Jaime Munguia business and they are invested in him as well and his future. I think that before it even becomes about Jaime Munguia versus Canelo Alvarez, what we might see is a Triple G rubber match. Oscar De La Hoya, who handles the career of Canelo Alvarez, was very recently quoted as saying, "When a fighter is in a trilogy like Canelo can do with Golovkin, it's the best thing for the sport. A trilogy means that the first two fights were excellent, and obviously people deserve a third," said De La Hoya to ESPN Deportes. "The fact that Triple G is talking to DAZN and can reach an agreement, that's a very good signal. That's the fight we want, Canelo wants. I do not know when it would happen, but that fight has to be done. That trilogy would be a very good one for the career of Canelo Alvarez. A trilogy with Triple G would be good for the story. It's a good sign that DAZN and Triple G are talking about securing that third fight." So as you can see, there are a lot of different options on the table. There are a lot of different variables that are out there for a fighter like Canelo Alvarez. I mean, how many people actually expected him to face Daniel Jacobs next?
Not a lot.
A lot of people, wrote that off. They didn't think that Canelo would go through with a fight like that due to the risks involved, and yet that's what he's doing. And before that fight came into fruition, there were any variety of names floating around for Canelo Alvarez. The name of Daniel Jacobs was there, the name of Triple G was there, but the name of David Lemieux was there. Demetrius Andrade's name was there. There were already any variety of options for Canelo Alvarez, and yet here he is facing Daniel Jacobs.
The riskiest one.
So if we move past that, if we fast forward and we think ahead, what if Canelo beats Jacobs? What's more likely to happen afterwards? Well, there are a lot of viable options. You have Jaime Munguia. You have the off chance that Canelo decides to jump up to light heavyweight for Kovalev, but you also have a Triple G rubber match. And we know that Triple G is in deep talks with DAZN and has been for some time now. As a result of that, there are any variety of rumors swirling as far as what kind of deal they're attempting to reach. But out of all those different names that are floating around, we've got to look at them and assess which fight is more likely than not in the event that Canelo beats Jacobs,
takes his belt
in May. And I dare say that as far as what ranks higher on the totem pole, as far as which fight is more likely than not, one can deduce that the people over there at Golden Boy, the people over there at DAZN, they know there's a lot of value in a Triple G rubber match. Particular to Golden Boy, they know that it's been a while since Triple G had a fight.
He's getting older.
He hasn't fought anyone
since the last fight.
Whereas Canelo Alvarez has kept busy with Rocky Fielding, and he's going to be fighting Daniel Jacobs. So if he and Golovkin square off against each other, it's conceivable that Canelo Alvarez will have been the busier fighter of the two. We know he's the younger fighter of the two, and he's holding 2 world titles. 3 if he beats Daniel Jacobs. So time would be on Canelo's side, and that makes a Golovkin rubber match all that much more appealing. In other words, they'd be on board for that fight. They'd be on board for that fight because 1, they know there's a lot of money in it, and 2, they know that the odds might actually favor Canelo the 3rd time around.
Against Golovkin.
So you use those aforementioned factors to rank these fights in terms of likelihood, and it's more likely than not that maybe we see a Golovkin rubber match before it becomes about Jaime Munguia. And if we look at Jaime Munguia, maybe it's more likely than not that we see Canelo fight him before we see him fight someone like Sergey Kovalev at 175 pounds.
Light heavyweight.
That in order from most to least likely, Golovkin would sit at the top, Munguia would sit in the middle, and Kovalev, even though he's an option, even though it's a fight that Canelo's interested in, he still would be sitting at the bottom. That in terms of likelihood, well, that would be the least likely of those 3 names. So, back to my original point, that while a Canelo Alvarez versus Sergey Kovalev is a very appealing, very intriguing kind of fight, there are a lot of other things that may come before that. So at this point in the juncture, the fact that that fight really isn't in the near future because there's so many other viable options, it's a nice idea. It's intriguing. Makes for an entertaining fight.
It does.
If it were in the near future, Sergey Kovalev's WBO title would be on the line. That would be an opportunity for Canelo Alvarez to become a world champion in yet another weight class. There are any variety of factors that would make that an appealing fight. But at the end of the day, it doesn't seem likely for the near future. It doesn't seem like something that's going to happen right now or 1 or 2 fights from now, because there are much more feasible options for Canelo right where he is than him jumping up there for Sergey Kovalev. In other news, Clarissa Shields had this to say: "Me and Hammer are fighting, unlike Ali and Wolf, and unlike Christy Martin and Lucia Riker." And what Clarissa Shields is basically talking about is that the previous generation of women boxers, as accomplished as they were, they didn't have the super fights that she's about to have with Christina Hammer.
They didn't.
That those fights were there, and those fights could have been conducive towards the growth of the sport had they actually come off. She was talking about rivals like Ann Wolf and Layla Ali, rivals like
Riker and Martin,
Lucia Riker and Christy Martin,
that never fought.
And she's not wrong when she makes this assessment. She's not wrong in that if those fights had happened at the appropriate time for them to happen, the sport itself might have actually been further along than it is today. But the next generation of women boxers, the next generation of fighters in women's boxing, they have a level of exposure that those fighters didn't have. They have a level of backing that those fighters didn't have. And that's indicative in this upcoming fight between Clarissa Shields and Christina Hammer, because bear in mind, this is going down on a major cable network. It's going down on Showtime. Understand that in women's boxing, there's been any variety of really good fights, really sizzling fights. Fights that fans would enjoy because there's a lot of action involved, a lot of punching, you know, not a lot of chess playing, not a lot of chess players. There have been any variety of fights like that that took place that flew largely under the radar. Fights like Obanov versus Maiva Hamadouche, IBF champion Maiva Hamadouche. That took place not that long ago. Yet the American public, for example, is largely unaware of a fight like that. But if you saw that fight, you would have liked what you saw because there was a lot of action. And that's not the only example. There's Hannah Gabriels versus Oxandia Castillo, 1 and 2. Cecilia Brækhus versus hard puncher from France, Sophie Anne Mathies. That same Sophie Anne Mathies versus Holly Holm, 1 and 2. The fight where Sophie Anne Mathies knocked out Holly Holm, and the fight where Holly Holm avenged the loss. Understand that there have been great fights that have flown largely under the radar for years and years and years. But whenever a woman boxer rolled around who got some attention, who got some momentum, the fact that those kinds of fighters did not have super fights, fighters like Lucia Riker, Christy Martin, Ann Wolf, Layla Ali, the daughter of Muhammad Ali, the fact that these fighters did do well for themselves, relatively speaking, but they never quite had that super fight, that signature fight, that fight that makes everybody stop what they're doing and pay attention. The fact that there was never really a fight like that way back when, it kind of inhibited the sport. Now, that's not saying that all these different fighters didn't contribute.
They did.
That's not saying that the previous generation of women boxers didn't contribute to where the sport is today. Of course they did. But this is the difference between this generation of women boxers and that generation of women boxers. That this generation's women boxers have the opportunity to have just those kinds of signature fights, those super fights. And Clarissa Shields versus Christina Hammer is an example of that. Yet another example of that is Katie Taylor versus Amanda Serrano. They're supposed to be fighting sometime down the line, and that is a super fight in a manner of speaking, because Katie Taylor is a very impressive Olympian and an upstart, and Amanda Serrano is one of the most accomplished women boxers as a professional. So the matchup between them is also a super fight, and it's not limited to just those 4 fighters. There are other women boxers in the wings, in the works, climbing up those ranks, and they will dish out super fights of their own when the time comes. That's the difference between this generation and that generation. That due to the contributions of the previous generation, this generation's women boxers have that foundation
that they didn't have.
Except what they have that the previous generation didn't have is the platform. I mean, you got a fighter like Michaela Mayer, not a world champion yet, but you got a fighter like Michaela Mayer, and she's got a big promotional company backing her in Top Rank. She fights on ESPN and ESPN+. You got Katie Taylor, and she's got Matchroom backing her. She fights on DAZN. Clarissa Shields is enjoying all the virtues of being a free agent. She's fought anywhere from DAZN to Showtime. And she's reaping the benefit of that in the exposure that she is getting, because she gets to float around to whatever network she needs to have the kind of fights that she wants to have. That's where this generation of women boxers differs. And that's why this signature fight between Clarissa Shields and Christina Hammer is a super fight unlike any other fight we've seen before it, because both fighters are undefeated, because both fighters are in their prime, because both fighters are champions, and the fight is happening at the right time. Timing is everything. So when Shields makes this assessment, she's not wrong. She's not slighting the previous era of women boxers. She's just stating an inconvenient truth, that while there have been many good women boxers over the years, and they've had some great fights, they really have, those kinds of fights still flew largely under the radar, whereas this fight is in a different arena than those fights. This fight between her and Christina Hammer is a step up from everything we've seen so far. And you know, I happen to agree. This is a bigger fight in terms of scale, magnitude, and significance, because this is for the undisputed middleweight championship. This, you know, all these different aforementioned factors make this a bigger fight than anything that women's boxing has delivered so far. And it appears that, as predicted, the WBC is going to do what they've got to do to accommodate their champion. They're saying, we 100% support Deontay Wilder. We'll rule on Brazil. WBC President Mauricio Suleiman basically went on to say that the governing board of the WBC has got to deliberate on what they plan to do, it being that even though Brazil is Deontay Wilder's mandatory challenger, they already ruled for him to participate in an interim fight. So they've got to sort that out. But basically, they are in 100% support of Deontay Wilder. And what that basically means, or at least what it could mean, is that whatever decision they decide to make, it's going to be to accommodate Deontay Wilder. You've got to understand that these morons went as far as ordering the Wilder versus Fury rematch, and now that's not happening. Now, if you were going to stick to the letter of the law, the rules that you guys basically made up yourselves, if you were going to do that, well, that would probably require you to strip Deontay Wilder for the fight not happening, or order a purse bid. And neither of those scenarios favor Deontay Wilder. So now what you've got to do is you've got to rearrange your own rules, rearrange your own mandates to accommodate him. So it's likely that what they're going to do now is go back on their own word and order Dominic Breazeale versus Deontay Wilder, even though that should have came before ordering a Fury rematch. Because the first Fury fight was a voluntary title defense. That wasn't a mandated title defense. That was an opponent of Wilder's choosing. Yet for some reason, WBC decided that no, y'all gotta fight next, even though Dominic Breazeale was already the mandatory challenger, according to you guys. This is more of the goofball decision-making that the alphabets have become synonymous with. That if you went as far as making Breazeale the mandatory challenger ahead of Dylan White, who was ranked at number 1, then why didn't you order that fight? What the fuck made you order Tyson Fury versus Deontay Wilder 2 in the first place?
Seriously, you gotta think about it.
What the fuck was the point in the WBC naming Dominic Breazeale Wilder's mandatory challenger ahead of Dillian White, who was ranked ahead of him? What was the point in that, only for you guys to turn around and order Wilder to fight somebody else? And now you've got to double back on that. What was the point?